Okay, welcome to the Lovecraft Easing podcast. Today is, what is it? It's June the 10th, 2018. And our guest is Steve Rasnic Tem. I am saying that right, aren't I, Steve?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And we'll get back to Steve in a minute after we do introductions, and Matt's got a pretty cool prize, especially for today. So I'm not feeling very well. I'm in a lot of physical pain. So any mistakes that I make, we're going to blame on Kelly, as usual. So,
right.
All right. Let's do introductions. Let's start with you, Kelly.
Kelly Young, executive editor, Strange Eons magazine.
Matt, and what prize do you have, Matt?
Hi, I'm Matt Carpenter. Just so you know, the book Pickman's Gallery is going to come out this year sometime. We are moving forward. Anyway, our terrific prize today is a
book.
Yeah, a hardcover copy, Out of the Dark, by no less than Steve Rasnic Tem, and it is in the gorgeous hardcover edition. It's just a beautiful book with lots of lovely little pictures in it from Centipede Press.
Awesome. Okay, we'll let everybody know how they can win that later. And Pete.
Yes, I'm Pete Relic, watcher of bad movies and writer of really bad stories, so that you don't have to.
Yes, somebody emailed me wanted me to tell you, or I'll look it up in a little bit, something about that alligator movie that you're always going on about. And the alligator people. They said it was just as horrible the second time around, and that you were completely wrong.
Yeah, it's a great movie.
Wait a minute, who was that? Let me.
That was Rick Sam again.
That was Rick Sam. Yeah. But he also says, but all is forgiven because he mentioned George R. R. Martin's tough voyaging as having great potential for a film.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. I don't know what that means.
Rick Lay writes even worse stories than Pete Relic.
Oh, I don't think that's true.
Or even possible.
Okay. We're having a little bit of an echo issue with Steve, so which is nothing I can't move around, but when I'm talking, I'll turn down Steve's volume. Steve, if you see that on your screen, that's why. And then when you're talking, I'll obviously turn it up so people can hear you. So for those very few people out there who don't know you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, my name's Steve Rasnic Tem. I've been a professional writer for about 40 years. I've published a little over 430 short stories, 7 novels, 11 collections, a lot of miscellanea. And primarily, I'm known as a horror writer, although I have written a fair amount of science fiction and crime and just straight fantasy.
I'll get to this in a minute, but you had some things to say in that primer. What was the name of that primer?
I can't remember.
Let's see. No, it's right here.
It's a primer to Steve Rasnic Tem, exploring dark short fiction, I think, something like that.
Well, yeah, you had a few things to say about horror in there, which I'll get to later, that I thought were very, very interesting, about horror being an emotion and not a category, that type of thing. So, I saw in an interview, or read in an interview, and this is really interesting because this is my wife's favorite book, To Kill a Mockingbird. You said that your favorite fictional character is probably Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird. So I thought I'd start with that question and ask you about that.
Well, yeah, I just think, to me, that's the quintessential American novel. It's brilliant. I think the character of Scout is well portrayed, and just I think the emotional depth of the prose is rather incredible. Whether she had help from Truman Capote or not, it's still, the results are quite brilliant. This is despite the fact that it has several thousand one-star reviews on Goodreads. It's still a wonderful book.
Yeah, pick any book that's a masterpiece that most people would consider a masterpiece, and there'll be people who give it bad reviews.
Yeah, it makes me feel better about my bad Goodreads reviews when I see that, I have to admit.
Now, I think it would take quite a long time to go over. You've written so many short stories, so many books, but could we start off and just talk about some of your newest books? For example, let's start off with Ubo.
Yeah.
What is Ubo about?
Well, Ubo, or Yubo, you could pronounce it.
Ubo, okay.
Is basically a meditation on violence. It's in the book, I have a main character, a narrator, who has been taken to this mysterious place, some kind of prison, and he is forced to enter the mind of various historical violent characters like Stalin, like Jack the Ripper, various figures like that, and he's being forced to experience what they experienced, but also to share some of their same feelings. And he has to work through, is he responsible for these things? Does he feel similar kinds of things? It's basically, as I said, a meditation on violence and people's capacity for it. It's a book I wanted to write since I was a freshman in college. Obviously did not have the ability to write it at that point. In fact, I really waited for a very long time to actually start with the actual composition. And then when I started writing it, still took 6 or 7 years before I really seriously thinking about it, before I could actually find a form and a structure that did what I wanted to do.
You've also written that violence is your greatest fear. I saw in another interview, and that, let's see here, let me read this. I usually write about the things which disturb me most, and nothing disturbs me more than our propensity for violence. So I'm assuming, did that make it a very hard book for you to write then?
Yeah, it did. But I'm also, when I choose things to write about, I usually, at least when I feel up to it, I try to choose subjects which are very difficult for me to write about, that are very difficult for me to think about. You may notice that most of my fiction is actually pretty nonviolent. It tends to be rather subtle, so I don't go to this place very often. And this particular book was the last book that my late wife Melanie read in manuscript. And I was also writing it towards her, and she had an absolute abhorrence to anything involving Nazis. Her grandfather was Jewish. Her family was affected by the camps. And so one of my goals was actually to somehow write about this material in a way that she could read it and get through it and appreciate it. And so that was one of the things that drove the composition of it.
That's a book that I have started, and I'll admit that I have not yet finished. And I do mean not yet, because I will finish it. But it's one of those books that I have to kind of read for a bit and then do a palate cleanser and go to something else and then go back to the book, because I probably can't word it as well as you can, but I share this abhorrence and this fear of the violence that humans seem to be endlessly able to perpetrate, so
I understand that, and that's one of the challenges of the book, was actually to make it readable for a certain segment of the audience. I know that some people will never be able to read the book. I know some people haven't been able to get past the cover. So I understand that, and I appreciate it, but it's a book that I had to write, and I'm very proud of it. And I will just say that there is a a ray of light at the end of this book. So
Okay.
it's not a completely pessimistic view of the world.
And no, I think it's a book that, not to say that any of the rest of your work isn't, but I think it's a book that needed to be written and needs to be read, because I don't know that we go there as often as we should, that we think about all the atrocious things that humans have done, you know, and try to reconcile it to what we want to be. So.
Yeah, it's a strange. Also, I found as a horror writer that most horror fans don't really like to get that close to really disturbing things in fiction. So you'll find actually, if you write about something that's really disturbing and it's close to the bone for a lot of people, that actually your readership goes down for that book, because a lot of people just don't have the stomach for it. They don't. Well, they'll say things like, you know, why would I want to read about that? And I understand that, but you know, you read about it because it's everywhere and it's an important thing to think about occasionally. And I do mean occasionally, because I highly recommend people watch comedies and light things. I have some friends who read nothing but horror and see nothing but horror movies, and I have to admit, I can't really understand that. I have to have things to lighten the mood. Personally, I'm an optimist, so I like optimistic things. I want to feed my optimism.
Yeah, you said somewhere that you make sure that you at least have one big belly laugh every day. So
pretty much, yeah. I laugh a lot during my life. So,
Yubo is available on Kindle and for print. It's available now. Is that your latest book, or is Figures Unseen your latest book?
Yubo came out last year. Figures Unseen came out this year in April.
Okay.
So Figures Unseen would be the latest book.
Can you tell us about that one?
Well, Figures Unseen is my selected stories. It's I took what I thought were either the best or the most representative stories from each of my collections, and I put it in this book. I've been wanting to do that for a long time. I've been wanting to do that before I'm dead, so that I could actually make the selections myself. So I approached Valancourt with it, and they liked the idea, and so I chose the stories, and I'm very proud of it. I think now that when people ask me what I do, I'll just hand them that book, because that pretty much represents the range and the flavor of the kinds of stories I write.
That's great, especially if someone is listening to this who hasn't read a Steve Rasnic Tem story, or maybe just one or two, and they see your body of work as very daunting to get all of that into, you know, and they could start with this basically.
It's got this great cover.
Yep.
You can see it. So the Valancourt books have wonderful covers.
Tell me about, since this is the Lovecraft Easing podcast, tell me about in the Lovecraft Museum.
Yeah, I've been wanting to write. I don't write much in the Lovecraft vein. A number of years ago, I had a Necronomicon Press chapbook.
Decoded Mirrors.
Decoded Mirrors, 3 after Lovecraft. And I wrote that specifically because I wanted to play in that area. I was interested. My first exposure to anything that I identified as horror fiction was Lovecraft. I read when I think it was the last year of college, all those John Holmes covers for the Lovecraft editions from Ballantine came out. So I bought them all and read them all, and it was my first exposure to his fiction. Now, I didn't want to write like that, but I found them really interesting. This whole idea of paranoia and this cosmic horror is something that I've always felt, not so much the paranoia part, basically. And now we live in very paranoid times, so it was something I wanted to play with at least. As far as in the Lovecraft Museum, I've been promising Pete Crowther a novella for about, well, ever since he started PS Publishing, maybe 15 years, something like that. But every time I would start a novella that I thought might be suitable, it turned out to be a short story. Or I would write something that really didn't seem to work. And so I would put it off and put it off until finally, first time I went to England, I had this experience of I don't know, I suppose this feeling of strangeness, because it seemed to me that I'd really knew nothing about Europe. And it just seemed to me that in England, they come up with slightly different solutions to mechanical issues that we've solved over here in different ways. The electrical system, the plumbing system. My wife made fun of me because one of the first things I did in the B&B was I went into the toilet and took off the tank lid and looked inside. And when we would go out walking around the streets, I would stop in front of hardware stores and look at all the various things they had in there that were different from what we had. And so I think that was the initial seed for that story, that kind of feeling of strangeness. And for a long time, I was going to write this story called Flying to England, which was about this transition from a normal world in the U.S. into somehow a strange world in England. But eventually, it came together with this Lovecraftian idea, and that's how the novella was born.
What's it? Can you give a little bit of a synopsis for it?
Well, in the Lovecraft Museum is about a man who's not a very good father, not a very good husband, who's distanced from both his wife and his daughter, or is it his son? I can't remember now. It was both at one point in the composition. But at one point, his child goes overseas and disappears. In the meantime, he becomes a correspondent with this fellow in England who is a Lovecraft enthusiast. And he's also become a Lovecraft enthusiast and an enthusiast of all the older weird fiction. And apparently this fellow overseas has started a appreciation society for Lovecraft. And he tells him about this Lovecraft museum that's been built outside London. So the story is about his going over there, flying to England and visiting the Lovecraft Museum and what happens there, and about his perceptions of England, which actually were very similar to some of my perceptions of England, especially flying into Gatwick Airport like 5 o'clock in the morning, and there being no one in the airport except those of us who were going down these endless ramps to get to the customs, and all that went into the book.
I see that you like the quiet ghost story.
Yeah.
What are some of your favorites and some of your favorite authors of those?
Well, I think actually, M.R. James, obviously, it was always an influence. Burridge is someone I've liked very much. I think most of the writers in the Jamesian school, Caldecott is another writer I like very much. Benson, E.F. Benson is someone I've always admired.
I just got an E.F. Benson audiobook from Audible read by Mark Gaddis. It's really well done. Yeah.
Yeah, the thing about the English ghost story is when I first read those stories, some of those stories, I read some of them in my grandfather's house, who had the only books I'd seen in a private home where I grew up for the longest time. And those books actually belonged to my great-grandfather. And there were several ghost collections in there. But when I read them, I thought it was spiritual literature or mystic literature. I didn't have any sense of it being horror literature. And later on, when I returned to reading that kind of material, I had that very much in mind. And I like ghost fiction in large part because to me it's a metaphor for the way we think about almost everything. And we think about almost everything in terms of the past.
That's interesting. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I think most people are obsessed with the past.
Mm-hmm.
If you talk to the average person and try to get a sense of what they're thinking about at the moment, it's rarely that it's rarely that they're actually thinking about the present. They're almost always thinking about something that's happened to them. So they're thinking about some sort of association. And in fact, that's one of the things that many therapies will tell you is one of the things that's wrong with people is the fact that we're so stuck in the past and we find it so difficult to stay in the now.
Right.
And so for good mental health, most of us need to try, of course, to live in the now. But it's also somewhat of a futile task because the past is always creeping in. And so the past, I think, haunts us. It informs us as to what limits us. It tells us what we can be or what we can't be. And a lot of my stories are about that kind of thing. To me, it's one of the most powerful metaphors we have.
It also informs us. I mean, if you had no memories, you wouldn't know who you are as a person. So there's.
That's true. Of course, is that really who you are, though?
Yeah.
Actually, can I say something?
No.
Okay, great. I read an interesting thing in an interview by Charlie Stross, you know, the English science fiction writer.
Yeah.
He was saying sometimes you'll be talking to an older person and they're taking a long time to respond, and you think they must be mentally slow. And he said, it's actually not often true. What's more is they have so much context to put everything into that it just takes them longer. That where young people have this immediacy because everything is still pretty new. When you've been around the block a few times, you've had experience with everything, and you've seen cycles come and go and repeat themselves. And you just sort of have to put everything into context before you can frame a response. I find that kind of interesting in this context.
From now on, when I take too long to answer someone, that's exactly the reason I'm going to give. That's my.
It works. I'm telling you, it works. When my kids talk to me, I'm just figuring out where this fits.
It's even more of a problem if you're from the South. I grew up in the South, and naturally, especially I grew up in Appalachia, and naturally from Appalachia we have a tendency to take our time to respond to almost anything. And so sometimes people think you're deaf or they think you're stupid. And it's definitely it's just a pace that you've learned for conversation. And I think it also has to do with going back over associations. I know when I was first married, my wife Melanie had a really difficult time deciding if I was ignoring her, if I hadn't heard her, or what was going on. She grew up in Pennsylvania. So it took a while for our speeds to come together in our marriage.
You a Susan Hill fan? I'm a big Susan Hill fan. The Quiet Ghost Stories.
Yeah, I do like Susan Hill. I think sometimes her stuff isn't as strong as it could be, but when it's good, I think it's really good.
Yeah, I've said this on the show before, but one of my favorite stories of hers is The Man in the Picture, and of course, a couple of movies have been made of The Woman in Black.
Yeah.
I wish they'd make a really good one from The Man in the Picture. I just recently finished a novella she wrote called The Small Hand that I agree I thought was a bit weaker than those other two.
It was.
Yeah. So.
Hey, Mike, can we can we talk about Deadfall Hotel?
We can, absolutely.
Because Deadfall Hotel has to be honestly one of my favorite novels. You talked earlier about violence and your dislike for violence in your writing, and Deadfall Hotel seems to linger on the edge of violence for the whole book. There's the potential for terrible things to happen, given the nature of the hotel being a vacation spot for the monstrous.
Mm-hmm.
But the people who run it are normal, and so the potential there for something horrific to happen is just always just right there on the outside of the page, and yet it never does really. There's a few places where it could happen, but it's a subtle, quiet kind of horror rather than overt, violent kind of horror.
Yeah, that was my major approach to the book was to have a sense of terrible things could happen in any second, but they don't. The most violent section in there is the King of the Cats section with the various kitties, and that's also the section that has bothered a lot of people because some cats die. I point out that to people that I like cats, I love cats. It was nothing personal. I wanted to choose an animal that everyone loved, and then somehow turn it into a horrific figure. So the cats had to be the one that I would do. I think with that book, it's paced the way I want it paced. I want it to be relatively slow and leisurely. I wanted to suggest a great deal, and people either like that or they hate it. Some people find that book unbearably slow. I don't. I find I don't really understand why they would call it slow, but some people do. Some people call U-boat slow. It's simply the way I describe things and the way I live in my books.
Okay, so I got to agree with Pete. In fact, he stole my topic, the bastard. I really like this book. And okay, there are certain authors, like I'm just going to say John Langan. When you read one of his stories, he's not in a hurry to get to the end. He lets the prose grow organically to fit the situation.
Yeah.
And so I didn't think the book was slow. I thought it was unhurried so that you could digest and really feel what was developing. That was how my impression of it. I really liked it.
That's the way I look at it. Unhurried is a good word for it, certainly.
To me, it's also about there are three human characters: a young child, an adult, and an older man, and how they react to things is very different. In many ways, it sort of reminds me of Something That Wicked This Way Comes from Bradbury, in that it's a coming of age story, but that age is a teen transitioning to an adult transitioning to old age, and an old man facing death.
Yeah.
And those are three different viewpoints on life, and they have different reactions in the book.
Yeah.
Is that something you thought about consciously, or?
Yes. I purposely chose their ages and the kind of people I wanted in there. Of course, with the older proprietor character, you're not really sure how old he is. He might be a lot older than 200. It's really hard to say. And I wanted it to be, in a sense, a metaphor for horror fiction. It was, when I first wrote it, I thought it actually might be the last time I would ever write about vampires and werewolves and the traditional stock figures of horror fiction. That turned out not to be true. I've learned not to say anymore that I'm not going to write about Lovecraft. I'm not going to write about werewolves because I always will. I always come up with an idea. But that metaphor, especially in terms of a fun house, that you see in the first of the book, that was what I was trying to do. And there is some suggestions about violence. There's certainly some references to the Nazis in the book, which I hoped people would remember if they ever got around to reading U-Boat years later when that got finished.
Just a wonderful book. And I got a review copy from Centipede. Was it Centipede? Yeah, Centipede.
Here's the hardcover, yeah.
Yeah, it was one of the first things they ever sent me. It was just a stunning debut. And I had only read you in Decoded Mirrors before. being a Lovecraftian, I have to focus on Lovecraftian fiction. Yeah. And Deadfall Hotel was sort of this first foray into weird fiction for me.
Jared did a wonderful job on the book, and I found the artist, John Ken Mortensen, to do the illustrations. Because at that point, he had never done any book illustration. All he had done were all these little illustrations on Post-it notes.
Right.
And you would find them on the internet. And so I called up Jared and said, what about this guy? I wonder if he could do a book. And so I was able to connect with him on Facebook, and Jared connected with him, and John was quite eager to do the project, and I was just blown away with the illustrations he came up with. So it was perfect for the book.
Were they skullbats?
Skullbees.
Skullbees. Yes, those were just beautifully rendered.
Yes.
Are we talking about the guy who does all the Post-it notes?
Yes.
Post-it note art.
Yep.
Sort of a cross between. He reminds me a lot of Edward Gorey, I guess.
Yeah, he doesn't. People say that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a lot of differences too.
Okay. I have another question, if you don't mind.
No, please.
One thing that I find sort of interesting about how you came into the, I don't know if you'd call it weird fiction, dark fiction, however you want to call it, that you didn't have the same reading at a young age, say, of other authors. Like, I just got my collected stories of Poe and I couldn't live without it. Or, I had this book by Peter Straub. It's like, I understand that you were like more into folklore and fairy tales. And I was wondering if you'd speak with that about that a little bit.
Well, the thing about, I grew up in Lee County, Virginia, in the heart of Appalachia, and in the early days, when I was in elementary school, there was no public library system there. There were small libraries in the high school and in the elementary school, and those were mostly donated books. And someone had donated a lot of folklore to the high school library, so I read most of the folklore they had in the library. At that point, I was interested in being a writer, but I didn't know what kind of fiction I wanted to write. When they finally did get a public library in Lee County, they got a bookmobile, and at that point, because I'd seen some science fiction movies on Saturday afternoon television, I was interested in science fiction, so I read every book in the library that had a rocket ship or a nebula sticker on it. And I read my way through Arthur C. Clarke and Asimov and people like that. And around that same time, my parents also agreed to buy a set of encyclopedias and a set of children's classics. I read all those. And so I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I wasn't sure what kind of thing I wanted to write or what kind of content. So I started writing science fiction stories and sending them to Ted White at Amazing. I knew about Amazing because in the next town there was a seedy little shop that had 2 pool tables and a bunch of magazine racks in the front. And they had Amazing and Fantastic back when it was really a pulpy kind of, still pulpy magazine. And they also had gold medal paperbacks and some science fiction or other science fiction magazines. So I read all those, and I thought maybe I wanted to be a science fiction writer because I liked the fact that it took you to another place, and the another place still felt like it was an important place, that it had said something about your life that you read, that you live today, that it had something to say about that. But I never really quite found anything that really fit for me until I got into college and I started reading some of the works by contemporary writers like Donald Barthelme or Richard Brodigan at the time, Italo Calvino. I was reading those with the folklore, and I found that kind of fabulistic sense was what I liked about the folklore. The four first horror novels I read, the four horror stories I read, as I mentioned before, were those Lovecraft books. And although I liked the ideas, I didn't want to write like that, and I didn't think those ideas really fit with who I was. I think my first sense of what kind of ideas I wanted to write about was I met a nurse who worked in a hydrocephalic ward in a state facility. And she told me these stories about hydrocephalic children, wards full of them, and how a lot of them died because they weren't held enough. And this just blew my mind. It seemed to me this is one of those realities that polite people didn't talk about and most people didn't know about. And it's kind of expanded my idea of what human beings were about. And I related it to some of my earlier investigations of things like the concentration camps. I remember when I was a kid, a friend of mine brought over that Life magazine that had the first images for the concentration camps. It took me a long time to believe that was even possible. So that kind of fit into it, along with the first images out of Hiroshima and the atomic bombs. And then hearing about these hydrocephalic children, I started seeking out congenital malformations. I talked to Clyde Barker about this once, that he and I both had this shared experience that we would look up these annuals of congenital malformations in the library and we would study them. And I found myself doing that same kind of thing. It was not because I think I had a particularly dark imagination. To me, these were just hidden realities, hidden secrets that I wanted to know more about. And so my first ventures into horror fiction really had to do with secrets and hidden realities and nightmares and dreams. And I think the form of those stories were really influenced by early readings in Ramsey Campbell and Dennis Etchison. My first sale was to Ramsey Campbell for New Terrors. I sold a story in 1979 that appeared in 1980. And around this time, I said, okay, I guess maybe I'm going to be a horror writer. So I spent the next few years just basically reading everything. I read all the old weird fiction. Went back to the ghost fiction I'd liked, and I could see how it now fitted into horror fiction and the kinds of things I wanted to write. And basically, I just read everything I could for about 5 years. And if you look at some of my stories from that time, they're getting a little bit more ambitious, a little bit longer. And it's part because I was learning more about the genre at that time.
By the way, that book that I was referring to earlier is Exploring Dark Fiction, #1, I believe, A Primer to Steve Rasnic Tem.
That's right.
And it's a pretty interesting book. I highlighted several things in the book that I wanted to ask you about. Before I get to that, I read a quote where you said, I think that most horror novels are failures. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, they're too damn long. You have a short story or a novella's worth of idea in there, and it gets padded out to be a novel. I think that's the way a lot of the horror novels of the 80s are written. They don't need to be that long. They could be much, much shorter. So they're a failure in that sense. I think one of the challenges of writing a horror novel is we feel like we have to make it scary. We feel like we have to rely on basic fears to make it scary. But basic fears, I think, is a fairly short-lived experience. You don't really need that many words to talk about them, really.
Right.
So you end up trying to find a way to expand the idea. Lovecraft expands the idea of horror by having this cosmology and this paranoia, which can be related to other aspects of life. And I think other writers have been able to do that with their own kinds of eccentric systems, not so much a cosmology, but their own view of life comes into the horror fiction. I think Ramsey Campbell does that very, very well. It's really a lens through looking at the world. and so you can bring other kinds of experiences into it. And I still think that's the challenge with writing a horror novel, is to write about. It's where they really fail is not on the horrific aspects, but they often fail on the realistic aspects. They write about Authors will write about characters doing things which they've written they do, characters feeling things that they wouldn't really feel, being afraid of things that they would be afraid of, and the author sometimes obviously isn't afraid of. So I think it's those real observational aspects of horror fiction that frequently you'll find that the writers are falling down. They really should read more Raymond Carver. That's one of my advice for people. Is they need to be more observational of real things.
That's not the first time we've heard that.
Yeah.
Horror writers need to read more mystery. Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Carver,
Lawrence Block.
Lawrence Block.
My favorite mystery writer. So.
Yeah, we've heard that
throw him in there
a bunch before.
Well, read Jonathan Franzen, read The Corrections. That's a wonderful novel. I think you just need to read widely into what other people are doing, and so you get some sense of how to handle detail and what details are important. Certainly, Raymond Carver is an ideal writer for that, because that's basically all he does is he observes things very, very carefully. You may not always be happy with his endings, but getting there, it's always fascinating.
One of the essays in Exploring Dark Fiction, number 1, is by you, The Subject Matter of Horror, an essay by Steve Rasnic Tem. And let me read this paragraph and ask you about it. The creation of a horror marketing category has provided more of us with an opportunity to sell our work, but in an aesthetic sense, it has damaged the literature as a whole. Although the arrival of horror packaging has focused a great deal of creative attention on this writing, it has also worked to simplify it, to reduce it to its lowest common denominator, in effect, to dumb it up. And, last week, Paul Tremblay was on here, and we were talking about when there used to be video stores where you had to go and rent a movie. Aren't really much of those around anymore. But there's always this horror section. But yet, when you go to Barnes & Noble today, as per example, there's mystery, there's romance, and then there's sci-fi fantasy. And any horror books you'll find typically in the sci-fi fantasy section. So, we were kind of coming at it in the conversation from, hopefully there'll be a horror section at some point, but it doesn't sound like that's what you're saying here.
Not really, although I enjoy horror sections in books, at least I used to when they had them. I was more interested in the horror novels that were shelved somewhere else, that weren't labeled as horror novels, that had dark material in them. I usually found those more interesting. I think the problem with genre horror is once we invented a category for it, we started putting certain kinds of covers on it. And I think writers were sometimes trying to write to those covers, to write really horrific stuff that would match those covers. And that's not the way most of us experience horror in real life. In real life, horror comes out of other things. We're not expecting it. It kind of creeps up on us. It happens subtly. That's the way we have horror in our real lives. And I think if you really want to reach someone emotionally, you have to include some of that kind of observation in your work.
You also write, horror has been referred to as the literature of fear. I think this has been a mistake.
Yeah, because I think, well...
And bear in mind, I'm not bringing these up because I want to put you on the spot and say, Steve, I disagree, because I don't. It's just very, very interesting to me.
Well, to me, it's more than that. I think it'd be more accurate to say that horror is the literature of anxiety. It's most of the horror that I enjoy makes me feel anxious more than it does terrify me. I think one of the disservices the horror movies have done for us is that when you use the word horror, people expect people to see people with their hair standing on end and their eyes wide and that level of experience, and that doesn't happen very often to us in real life, if ever. Whereas all of us feel uneasy, all of us feel anxious, all of us are afraid of dying, all of us are afraid of our loved ones dying. And those are the things I'm interested in, and those are the things I'm interested in exploring. And that's, to me, the whole of life, not just these isolated, fearful experiences. It is a dark literature, and it's a literature, if you will, about some of the darkest things we're capable of and the darkest things that can happen to us. But I think it's also important to realize that it's only dark in context. It's only dark when you compare it to, some of the great beauty that can happen in relationships in your family with your kids. So I think a lot of horror needs more of those elements so that we actually get the contrast and we actually get the sense of what is lost when things go wrong. And as inevitably they do go wrong in most of our lives.
Michael Arnzen, is that right?
Yeah.
He writes, let me see if I can find this here. Well, he's talking about your take on the American dream, that, quote, produces only nightmares. By the way, I really, there's some great things in this book, talking to the audience now. Exploring Dark Fiction, #1. It's edited by Eric Gennard, am I saying that right? And Steve Rasnic Tem, primer. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because it seems like in a couple of these stories, you're really turning the American dream upside down, so to speak.
Well, truth is, I've never really quite thought of it that way, except I think a lot of what we call the American dream means ignoring the downside. It means ignoring the things we've done, in terms of our treatment of other races, our treatment of Indians, as far as how we got this country. I think it ignores the plight of the poor. Most things, in order to enjoy the American dream, and in some ways you really have to have selective amnesia about the rest of the things that are going on in the world.
Yeah.
And so I do write about that. And it's part of that whole secrets and hidden realities kinds of things. That doesn't mean I think there's necessarily anything wrong with the American dream per se. I just would like to see it expanded so that other people can enjoy it as well.
I believe that the horrors boom, 80s horrors boom, and the general popularity of horror was an aberration. It may happen again, but I doubt it. That's something you said.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I'm speaking mostly in terms of economics.
Okay.
There are the outliers now of writers who can make a great deal of money and writers who are successful in the mainstream. And Paul Tremblay is one, and I think he's a wonderful writer. And Josh Malerman is another. I think he's a wonderful writer. And these are writers I love and books I love. I think that a lot of horror now is published in the small press. It's published online. There's a lot of it, but there's not a lot of money in it. And I actually don't really see a time. I don't expect to see a time in which horror is a popular mainstream buying choice in terms of the literature. Films, yes, I think people will watch films, but films are almost a completely different genre in terms of the content than horror fiction. I just don't expect to happen what happened in the 80s. It happened in part because publishers wanted to duplicate the success of Stephen King, and they discovered they couldn't. And also, if you read a lot of the horror novels from the 80s, a lot were very, very gimmicky, weren't particularly good books, but they had that kind of campy appeal to them. And the thing about campiness is it's a experience which doesn't last. People aren't interested in it for a very long time. So I don't really see the boom happening again.
Well, you mentioned a couple of writers that you really like just now. What are some of your other favorite writers working today in horror or any genre?
Well, I like Simon Strantzis a lot. He's one of my favorite short story writers. There are a lot of short fiction writers. Linda Rucker, who's a British writer, she has a column in Black Static. I think she's the closest to an Aitman-like writer we have. Her stories are just wonderful. I did the introduction for her first collection, and I had the experience of really wishing I had written some of those stories. And I rarely had that experience. So it was, I was really envious by the time I'd finished reading that collection. I thought it was wonderful. Another writer who's a very fine stylist is Karen Warren from Australia. She spells her first name Kaaron. And she has a book out now, which I just read, Tide of Stone, which is wonderful. And she's just another wonderful writer. Some mainstream people I'm reading now. Joyce Carol Oates' new collection, Night Gaunts, is out, and I'm loving that. Let me see. I've also been reading Stephen King's The Outsider, which I gather some of you have been reading too. And I've been really enjoying that. I find that Stephen King is still someone I always return to, and I always enjoy. I sometimes will have an issue with the prose here and there, but I don't really care. I just enjoy the way he gets into characters' heads and the way he writes. To me, he has a really addictive voice. Same reason I always liked Charlie Grant's work.
Oh yeah, me too.
Charlie Grant was an early mentor. In fact, I learned how to write horror fiction a lot by writing for his anthologies, by writing for Shadows. And he had the kind of voice that was comforting and lovely just to hear and to hear in the reading. And it was consistent throughout all his books. And I think when you have that, you can write almost anything and people are going to want to read it.
Yeah, you can't see it from this angle, but I've got almost a whole Charlie Grant shelf over here to my right. I regret that I never got to meet him because I sure do love his work.
Well, he was a wonderful guy.
That's what I hear, yeah.
Very generous guy.
Who were a couple of your other mentors? You just mentioned Charlie Grant as a mentor.
Well, Alan Ryan was someone who I knew from the anthology, from Charlie's anthologies, and Alan started editing, and so he and I would correspond back and forth. And Alan would actually read some of my stories and mark them up and send them back to me, and I would rewrite them. And eventually, I got into some of his anthologies with things I wrote. Another mentor early on was Roy Torgerson, who did a series of anthologies called Chrysalis, and he was actually very, very encouraging. He would call me up in the middle of the night, these drunken phone calls, which weren't always welcome, but and I'm a small town guy basically, and he's from New York, and he knew everybody, and I knew no one, and so it was kind of exciting to get these calls from him, but it was also a little strange. He would call me up, and Lynn Carter would be sitting there next to him, and they'd both be drinking, and they would tell me stories, and Lynn Carter eventually bought some of my stories for his incarnation of Weird Tales, the anthology series. And it was just a very, very heady, but they both did that thing which a lot of people in the genre do, is they overpraised me. there's a lot of overpraising in horror fiction, especially from young writers. And I'm not sure it's a good thing, but they certainly did it to me, and it certainly was encouraging. I'll have to say that.
You wrote a book with your wife called Yours to Tell, Dialogues on the Art and Practice of Writing. Can you talk just a little bit about that book? And then I'd like to ask you probably the question I don't usually ask writers, but since you wrote this book, the question that probably gets asked way too much, which is what is your advice to aspiring writers?
What was that last one?
What's your advice to aspiring writers? I think that question gets asked too often, but I wanted to ask it here because of that book.
Okay. Well, here's the book, in case anyone has not seen it. Apex published it, and it's available online from all the major book dealers, I guess. Well, the basic advice, the first piece of advice I give most writers who want to write short stories is I tell them to read at least 1,000 short stories carefully and notice how the story begins, notice how the story ends, and if it's a beginning they really like or an ending they really like that they think is powerful, write it down. Start collecting different strategies for beginning stories. Start collecting different strategies for ending stories. Also, notice how does the story developed. Does the author hang the structure on some sort of pattern? Is there rising and falling action? Just try to figure out how the writer does what the writer does, and read this. Do this for like 1,000 stories at least. Then do another 1,000, and don't. You can pick horror stories if you want to, but I always tell people to read widely, to read stories that are published in the literary journals, in the college magazines, read mainstream stories, read realistic stories, read science fiction stories, read stories in genres you don't like. Just anything, any kind of story that will give you a sense of what other people are doing, because you really need to build up a repertoire of how to start things, how to end things, how to develop things. And as much you can teach people about those things as much as you like. But to me, there's no substitute for reading a ton of stories and to think seriously about how they work to get that down. Because one of the more common problems that young writers tell me is they don't know how to start something. And then they don't know how to end it. They think they're okay in the middle. But then, of course, as they get older, they realize that their middles are a mess. So they need some help trying to figure out how you structure a middle. So I think that's maybe the most important piece of advice I give writers.
You wrote that with your wife, and can you talk about what she contributed as opposed to what you contributed?
Well, I think in some ways she contributed all the smart stuff. And mine was more of the anecdotal stuff. My wife was an excellent writer and maybe the best editor I've ever known. Nothing ever left this house of mine that she hadn't read and I hadn't responded to. She read everything I wrote, and I read everything she wrote. And that's one reason I knew how good she was. And she had a more serious kind of training in that she had gone to the bread loaf writing conference, where actually she met Asimov and spilled a pot of hot coffee in his lap. So that was her one genre connection. And when we started talking about, we talked about how to write all the time. I think that the two things we talked about most was we talked about our kids and we talked about writing. And we were asked to teach at the Odyssey writing workshop as writers in residence for a week. I think that was in '95, something like that, and or 2005. I can't remember the exact dates, but we weren't sure how we were going to do it. So what we finally decided to do is we would we would pick an area of writing every morning. It would be having to do with subtext, for example, or plot or character. And when we got in there with the students, she and I would just have a dialogue and say everything we could think of to say to each other about the subject for the day. And sometimes we would disagree. Sometimes we would agree. We would give examples. We would talk about our own writing. And that's how we would start each day. And the students seemed to like that. And they also said that we were saying things that they hadn't heard before. At least we were saying them in a different kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And that was when we first started thinking that maybe we should do a book. Melanie was skeptical. She was always skeptical about there being a need for another writing book, but I felt like we needed to get on record somehow. So we continued those dialogues, and when we were actually composing the book, we had access to the recorded tapes of those lectures we gave, and we also added on to them, and we had done some other kinds of nonfiction writing about how to write, and we incorporated that, and that's basically what you see in this book. It pretty much covers everything we knew on the subject in as concise a way as possible.
Again, that's called Yours to Tell, Dialogues on the Art and Practice of Writing. If you could go back in time and talk to yourself when you started in 79, 80, you were getting published, and what would you want to tell yourself, or what would you want to tell a young aspiring writer? Let me rephrase that. What are the biggest mistakes maybe you made, or an aspiring writer possibly makes, that you'd like to caution them against?
Well, I don't know if they were mistakes really, except maybe in terms of strategy and organizing a career. Ideally, I should have written novels earlier,
mm-hmm.
because in terms of a career, novels really have much more effect on your career than short stories ever will. People notice the novels. Often I've had the experience where people know they've read something by me, but they can't remember what it was. They've seen my name everywhere, and they know they've read lots of my fiction, but things just don't quite stick for them because the stories are too short. Sometimes they will mention some specific story, but often I get more general kinds of comments. I think I'm finding at this point, there's still novel ideas that I want to write. I don't know if I have time enough left to write them, particularly when you look at my first few novels took 15 years or 20 years a piece to write. Not every day, of course, I try to tell people that, but that was how long the process took. So I would say that. I would also tell my younger self to try to find an agent earlier. I don't have an agent right now. I let my last one go, and I'm more or less representing myself, but I think I would have done the agenting thing differently. Other than that, I don't know. I think the whole stumbling around and finding solutions and making mistakes really seemed to have worked for me. I think that not everything I've written is wonderful. And I think in some ways, people have seen my development as a writer in actual publication. And that some of my earlier stories, which maybe shouldn't have been published, were published. But they were part of the path to get to where I am today and to learn how to write stories.
I know a lot of especially aspiring writers, and most writers maybe, I don't know, view success as a writer as financial success. In other words, they're making enough of a living that this is the only thing that they really have to get up every morning and do, when I think we know that that's not quite as common as maybe some of them think. I know that you had a day job until you retired. Is that right?
That's right.
You retired just a few years ago.
Year and a half ago. In fact, they gave me this thing, a writer's block, for all my years of working for this lumber company, for the software division. Yeah, I worked for about 35 years as a technical editor and writer in the software industry. Um, and I guess early on, I was thinking about, do I try to be a full-time writer and at least a full-time fiction writer? But I had kids, and kids who wanted clothes, and kids who wanted to be fed, and kids who needed insurance. And it seemed to me that it really wasn't viable. Uh, I knew writers who had done it, but most of them either had a spouse who made a lot of money, or they chose not to have kids, or they were always poor and they never had insurance, and their kids didn't have insurance if they did have kids. And it just seemed to me not a good choice. Um, and at least as a technical writer, I was still writing for my money, and it was not always thrilling writing, but I actually think it made me a better writer. Technical writing requires you to be precise and in control, and I think I learned a lot of just the facility of writing by being a technical writer and editor. Certainly made me more conscious of language, and also it was very freeing then to go write what I wanted, write my own fiction. So I like the contrast actually, and I like movies. I like books. I like going out to dinner every once in a while. I like the fact that now that I'm retired, I had a 401k. I had a small pension.
Right.
I could now afford good insurance. I'm not a rich person, but I'm getting by just fine. I think the only difference between now and when I was working full time is that I can't afford travel as much as I used to. But that's not such a bad thing to give up. So I think it really worked out for me.
It's truly amazing the body of work that you've amassed while working 35 years at a day job.
Yeah.
First thing I'd like to say, and then this is a question that I think I ask almost every writer who comes on here. Given all what we've just talked about, what does success as a writer mean to you personally? And everybody answers this differently when I ask them.
To me, success as a writer is being able to write what is in your heart to write and to get it published. To me, that's the success, to be able to get that writing published that you really care about, and to be able to say the things you want to say and to tackle the subjects that are really difficult, but that are very close to the center of your being. And that is a privilege that most people don't have. It's you're giving the opportunity to give a kind of testament as to what it was like for you during your time on the planet. Very few people get that opportunity. So if you can get that opportunity and you can get it published, that's wonderful. It's hard to beat that. And the money's nice, but there's no substitute for that. Because, well, for one thing, I always found I could make more money doing other things than writing. So making money writing didn't particularly impress me because of that.
Well, again, yours to tell dialogues on the art and practice of writing for any writers listening to this, and I know a lot do. And then Yubo came out last year.
That's right.
And then this year was Unseen Figures, correct? Figures Unseen. I'm sorry. I guess you said that's the book that you would hand to people if they asked, what kind of stuff do you write? Figures Unseen.
I think it's the best cross section I could give them.
Okay.
To be that book.
And then Yubo, of course, is, I think, a must read. So.
Oh, thank you. Also, I should mention that later this year, there's a publisher called Hex Publishers, a local press. We're doing a middle grade novel of mine, The Mass Shop of Dr. Black, which is about a 12-year-old girl and her brother at Halloween. It's somewhat reminiscent, I suppose, of Bradbury's The Halloween Tree, but with a female protagonist. And they're bringing that out in early October. And next year, in the spring, Centipede is bringing out my next collection, which is called The Night Doctor and Others. And Jared's trying something a little bit different this time. I've been complaining to him that although the Centipede books are beautiful, I don't like the idea of collections of mine being so expensive that people can't afford them, or when they do buy them, they put them immediately on the shelf and don't read them. I do want to be read, and I do want to be affordable. And I think, like most short story writers, and in this genre, a lot of short story writers are in the same boat. So he's trying this new thing where he's going to do a larger print run and less expensive books. And so The Night Doctor and Others will be a 1,000-copy print run of hardcovers that are affordable. And that should be out sometime in the spring. And that includes some of the newer stories that came out since Out of the Dark came out. And I think also has some of my strongest stories in years are in this book. So I'm very pleased with it. And then people will be able to afford it too.
Yeah, we've had that conversation on the show before, that those are incredible books. I've got a Willem Pugmire book that he gave me, a Centipede Press book, but I'm almost afraid to touch it.
Yeah.
You know? So.
He hasn't come up with the final price yet, but I think he's talking about like the $25, $26 range for the hardcover. So
that'd be great.
So that's really what I want to see.
What was the title that's coming out this October?
The Mass Shop of Dr. Black.
Okay.
And Black is spelled B-L-A-A-C-K.
Well, I'm a big Autumn fan, big Halloween fan, so I'm definitely looking forward to that one.
That's coming out in hardcover and paperback and ebook at the same time.
I'd also encourage anyone listening, Pete was talking about Deadfall Hotel. Go to Steve Rasnic Tem's Amazon page. Rasnic is R-A-S-N-I-C, and then the new word T-E-M for those of you listening in your car. Steve Rasnic Tem, and go to, there's a lot to choose from. So, guys, is there any other questions we want to ask Steve before we let him get to his nap?
Oh, please let him get to his nap.
Steve, I can't tell you what an honor it is to finally meet you more or less in person, and thank you for being on the show.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I rarely get invited places. I don't get invited to parties anymore, so this is like the next best thing. So.
We saw you at Necronomicon last year, though, right?
Well, it's rare,
Was he there?
I wasn't invited. I just kind of snuck in and paid them money, and I went. So
really? Because
well, I'm sure they were happy to see me. Oh, hi, Pete. I'm sure they were happy to see me, but it's one of the things that happens as you get older. People stop inviting you to places because I think they're afraid you're dead. But they're too embarrassed to really check it out for sure. So you get crossed off the invitation list. And what happens is, a few years later, you do die. And then people on Facebook said, I thought he died years ago. But what really happened was they just stopped inviting you to places. So you're not showing up.
Or they say all the nice things, the day that you die. They say it on social media that they should have told you before you died.
That's right.
So as someone who has chaired a con in the past, I will tell you that there are contingency plans if a writer dies during the con.
Yeah, they call Pete Rollick.
Oh, is that supposed to be a selling point?
Well, it's if the author dies before they get there or after they leave, it's not their problem. But
I see.
If they're there.
If they're there, there's a plan.
There's a plan.
Well, no offense, but I don't, just for my kids' sake, I don't want to die at a fan con. You know,
Yeah.
that's not the way I want to go.
No.
You know? I mean, I love the literature and I love conventions, but that's not where I want to die.
I don't understand why. I just.
I don't know. There's just something. I don't know. There's just something that's uncool about it to me, I guess. But
Well, no, I think if I remember right, and I'm getting older too, so my brain's failing me at times. But if I remember right, it was when John Lang was on the show, and I asked him about writers he liked, and he mentioned your name, and I thought, why have I never asked Steve Rasnic Tem to be on the show? I got to fix that. So,
did you think I was dead?
no, I honestly did not think you were dead.
Okay.
It just
Let's go
there are a lot of writers I haven't got around to asking yet. So you're on that huge list.
Well, I really appreciate it. It's been fun, and I listen to the show all the time. I especially like the show with Michael Cisco because you should listen.
And he read for about 10 minutes from Unlanguage, which is really a treat, you know?
Yes, I have that book.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for being on the show, Steve. I think I'm in a lot of physical pain today, so I apologize if I was a little off my game or anything, but I really enjoyed having you here.
Oh, you were fine. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to talk about a few other things now before we go. So I know if you want to get to your nap, you can just close the browser window and they'll kick you out of here. So
I'm going to do that.
all right.
Thank
you, Steve.
Thanks,
Great
Steve.
to see you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. He's given a writing primer there. That's awesome.
Boy, no kidding. I mean, those last couple of episodes with Steve and Adam Neville, Paul Tremblay, if you're a writer, this is good stuff.
And I am going to stop over.
You're actually recommending this show now, Kelly?
I am going to stop overpraising you guys. I've been praising you far too much. I'm just going to say what I really think about you. I feel free.
That's my problem with Kelly. I've been overpraising him.
I feel free now.
I immediately went on to, if you're listening live, Matt is always updating the easy message board with links to everything that everybody's talking about. And I immediately went and grabbed that writing book by Steve. So
yeah, which for those of you listening later who don't know what Kelly's just talking about, the Lovecraft Easy message board is actually a group on Facebook. Just search for Lovecraft Easy message board, you'll find it, and ask to join the group, and I'll approve you a day or two later, unless you're a bot. So, yeah. So Robert. Oh, and I want to apologize for the echoes earlier too. I did my best with those, and I'll try and weed some of them out if I can for the audio only version. But I think overall it went pretty well. Robert Kirkman's History of Comics. Kelly.
Yeah, I just started watching this. I guess this was on AMC first. It's called Robert Kirkman's Secret History of Comics, and it's a 6-episode season, and it just moved over to Shudder, which is where I started watching it. And it's just a really neat documentary style series, 6 episodes so far. The first episode on Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And man, I know we've got a lot of comic book geeks listening to us, and I thought it was absolutely fascinating. So I think Rick would probably love this. You guys are probably aware of it. I think I'm late to the game on this one.
Did they go into how what they call the Marvel method, where the artist really writes, where Stan Lee gives Jack Kirby an idea of the story he wants, and then
they didn't come right out and ask them about the Marvel method, but he describes that a little bit there, and they talk about some of the things that Jack had done that then Stan would come in and say, oh, what is this character? Like Stan didn't, in the Galactus trilogy where he introduces Galactus, Stan didn't have the Silver Surfer in that. Jack drew a picture of this silver guy on a surfboard, and Stan said, what is this? And he said, oh, I thought there should be a herald for something this big. And he goes, fantastic, we'll call him the Silver Surfer. And so he started writing dialogue around stuff that Jack had drawn, and it was just really interesting episode. The next episode 2, is The Truth About Wonder Woman. Episode 3 is The Trials of Superman. Episode 4 is City of Heroes. 5 is The Color of Comics. And then the final episode for this season is Image Comics. And as a lot of people know, Robert Kirkman is I think he's the CFO of Image Comics. And that's where The Walking Dead came from and all of that.
What is this? What is this Wonder Woman secret? Or have you not got there yet?
I have not gotten to that yet.
Well, if you watch the movie Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman,
Yeah.
which I'm trying to think. Well, I think I got that on Hulu. That tells you what the secret of Wonder Woman was.
I saw that was on there. Is that a good movie, or
It's a very good. I thought it was a very good movie. It made one mistake. It said that Marston was working for the OSS during World War I, and the OSS didn't exist then. It would have been military intelligence or something else.
Right.
I'm increasingly starting to think that Rick was the reviewer of the Bourne Supremacy that you pointed out one time.
That's right.
I have never read any Bourne books, just for the record.
No, the movie.
Not even the movie. I've never. I'm trying to think. I think I read. I read 2 books by Ludlum.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, I went through a huge Ludlum phase, and in like the late 70s, I read like 10 or 15 of his books. Then I realized they were all very similar. And
yeah,
whatever the one was about an organization
Like Dean Koontz
in Corsica that was killing people. I think it was something like the Scarlatti Inheritance or something.
yes, I remember that.
That's it.
All right, so It Part 2 release date appears to be September the 6th, 2019. Did you
That's
see?
a bad date.
Yeah, a terrible date. Yeah. Is that your birthday?
No, it's just a bad date.
No. Well, have you seen the actors for this, Kelly?
yeah.
Are you
I don't.
happy with the actors?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy with everything that they're doing.
Okay. Oh, okay, that's a short conversation.
Who are the actors?
I'm trying to remember. I know Bill Hader was just announced as
James McAvoy.
Yeah, James McAvoy, who I thought actually looks quite a bit like the kid that he's playing Bill, right? Bill Denbrough.
Yeah.
I thought he was dead.
No, no, not yet. But it will happen someday. It'll happen someday. I can promise you that.
Is that the guy who plays Professor X? Or
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. There's a movie, a couple of Lovecraftian movies coming out apparently, and I don't know when this one's coming out. It's called The Letter, a Lovecraftian Tale. So I'm just reading off IMDb. I can't remember how I even heard about it.
I was sent an email from a friend
Okay.
whose hometown was being used as a set.
The whole town.
They were burning down a barn and filming it for the film.
Oh, that's right.
Yep.
The synopsis on IMDb is, in 1922, a young man inherits a mansion whose grounds are so sinister that he may meet the same fate of its previous owners. So I guess we'll place that one in the might be good, might not be good category. But I think what we can place in the probably definitely is good without having seen it yet is The Endless, which I've really been wanting to see. And it's going to be available on digital, DVD, and Blu-ray on June 26th. So we're going to know pretty shortly here. You guys know what that's about?
I'm not familiar with that one.
No, I'm not even.
It actually looks really good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's about these brothers who, let me pull up the page, but it's about these brothers who grow up in this cult and then they flee from it. The official synopsis on IMDb is, 2 brothers return to the cult they fled from years ago to discover that the group's beliefs may be more sane than they once thought, which, take it from me, that would be truly horrifying. But you got to watch the trailer for The Endless. It's really, it does look really good. So
if you're talking Lovecraftian movies,
Yeah.
Barbara Crampton has been dropping hints about something,
Good to know.
and something that goes by like an expanded Lovecraftian universe.
Oh,
And
I was gonna make fun of you for being vague, but that sounds
no,
really
that's the, and like I'm flying to the set, and
oh.
we're working on this. I'm not telling you anything else, and just yeah.
So, what is Stuart Gordon going to make a series of TV shows? That's what it sounds like.
I don't know. I read someplace else that they were remaking or at least rewriting a script for Castle Freak / The Outsider.
Hmm.
So maybe this is a linchpin piece. I'm not sure. It would be very interesting to do something through them.
Benjamin Handelman's on the live YouTube chat, and he's asking if I've read The Outsider yet. I have not read The Outsider yet.
I'm listening to it. I have it on CD. I'm listening it to in my car. I'm about 2/3 done. I have been really enjoying the slow build-up police procedural. I will agree. Kelly had mentioned last week that they introduced a character from Mr. Mercedes, and I found that stylistically jarring. Why introduce another major narrative character at this time, except, one thing Stephen King likes to do is have his stories refer back to each other to greater or lesser degrees. It's still not lessening my enjoyment, but I wish he had just used the characters he had.
Well, since I've fallen behind on my Stephen King, I've now got to not read The Outsider. Do I read the Mr. Mercedes trilogy?
I just read the first book of that. I haven't read the whole trilogy.
I don't think it's necessary to read the trilogy, and she's not introduced in a way that that you need to know what's going on prior to this book.
That's good to know.
A few fragments of her internal dialogue refer to characters from that trilogy, but you could just it doesn't hurt you to not have read it, I don't think.
No.
I mean, what do you think, Kelly? You've read the book.
I'm not done with The Outsider right now, although I am really enjoying it. I did not enjoy the Mr. Mercedes trilogy that much, and I'm liking this quite a bit more. I don't think that it's necessary to read the Mr. Mercedes trilogy. I wouldn't actually suggest that to anybody, to be honest.
Yeah, it didn't look like it would interest me.
The TV show was, the best I could hope for was that they just kind of followed the story, I guess, and instead the TV show was brilliant. It was much better than the book.
Not something you say about the typical Stephen King movie.
No.
So, Matt and Rick, were you there last night? I couldn't tell. Lake Mungo. So
yes,
I would say that was excellent.
Yeah, Paul and I, all of us were talking about Lake Mungo last podcast. And so, we do the Lovecraft Easing movie night on Saturday nights. I thought I'd show it to everybody. And Matt, you hadn't seen it, and Rick, you hadn't seen it, right?
Right. I gotta say, it didn't do much for me for a couple reasons. First of all, I won't give anything away to say that this Australian family has a 16-year-old daughter, and she drowns. And then they are starting to experience phenomena surrounded, like around her room, where there may be something supernatural going on. Okay, so it's done in this faux documentary style. And I probably would have preferred a straight-up telling of the story because I thought all of the family members were very detached. So it's like none of them were expressing, like, they all had flat emotions. none of them had the anger or fear or grief that you would think that they would. And I also thought at the very end, it's sort of like the big revelations weren't like big hammer blows.
Yeah, it's amazing how much I disagree with you on this.
But I thought the story was atmospherically done. So the videotape clips that they showed, those were very well shot, and I really liked the musical score.
Yeah, that's true. Rick, what'd you think?
I thought it was a good documentary style movie. It raised some issues. I always wonder, would I ever actually participate in a seance if given the opportunity? And I wonder what you guys would say. I would probably refuse.
I would say no unless something like that had happened and I started to have good reason that a seance would be or might be useful. I really can't imagine any of that happening, but if someone asked me tonight, Mike, do you want to go to a seance? And be like, no, I gotta stay home and wash my hair or something.
Well, I've read too many, it's almost like participating in the black magic ritual. That's how I've always viewed it. And I've always wanted, we've read enough horror stories where you might invite something in. And even though I don't believe in the supernatural, I don't want to tempt fate.
Mm.
And also, since most of us won't believe in the supernatural, we could believe in something Lovecraftian in a science fiction sense. And maybe that's what comes into the seance.
You say most of us or most people?
Well, I was saying us.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Because I've read a lot of horror stories where I think Bag of Bones was an example of this, where ghosts are really creatures from outside that have taken on the semblance of somebody who died, and they're not really spirits in the true sense. They're imposters.
Yeah.
Which I always found an interesting concept.
Well, I really enjoyed Lake Mungo. That was my second time viewing it, of course. And I think it's one of the scariest is not the word. I think scary and horror, as Steve was saying, means different things to different people, paraphrasing. But creepiest and eeriest. One of the creepiest and eeriest movies I've ever seen. So, of course, don't watch it during the daytime if you haven't seen it. Wait till about 11 o'clock at night, midnight, turn off all the lights in the house, and then watch it, and you'll definitely be more creeped out. So Matthew, you want to start reading Repairman Jack, huh?
Yeah. My wife got me okay, so I've been reading on my Kindle on my phone at lunch because I've ruined a lot of books by leaving them in the car for months at a time. And then my wife saw me like I got these ancient eyes. I'm squinting into this phone and not really. So she bought me a Kindle reader. So I'm always looking for books to read at lunchtime. And Stephen King is an old standby. That's how I read Tommy Knockers and Mr. Mercedes. But you guys love Repairman Jack. And I was looking for something different where I might have several books in a series to read. So I thought, what the heck, I'll give it a go. So I just was wondering where to start. What's the book I should start with? And then where do you go from there?
Kelly, you want to take that or you want me to?
Well, I mean, Repairman Jack starts with the book The Tomb. And Mike, you had said that you don't need to read The Keep to get into Repairman Jack unless you read all 18 books in the Repairman Jack series, which at about book 17, the events of The Keep start bleeding into what is happening. The Keep has its own.
The fact that The Keep is one of his best books.
It's such a good book, yeah. And it's part of its own trilogy that Repairman Jack eventually gets folded into.
And also, when he did a prequel to give you the origin of Repairman Jack, it tied heavily into the adversary cycle is what the keep becomes.
Right.
The two.
Is it me or just Rick? Rick,
I think Rick just went out.
You just went out. Your audio just went out, Rick.
Okay,
There you are.
There he is.
The Tomb is a standalone story that will give you a flavor of whether you want to continue with the series or not.
Yeah.
You know, but besides the cosmic horror element, they're just fun reads. You know, it's this guy Jack who just doesn't want to be part of the system. That's one of the things that I really like about him. I mean, he doesn't even have a social security number, I don't think.
Yeah, he's completely off the grid.
Yeah, he is way off the grid. And
well, it's a pulp style history battling hero battling Lovecraftian monsters.
Yeah,
it's sort of a cross between or sort of probably closer to Mike Hammer rather than the Shadow, but a very tough as nails vigilante style guy.
I always kind of felt like, and I think Mike, you're a fan of the Jack Reacher novels.
yeah.
I always kind of felt like, what's his name, who wrote those, read Repairman Jack and said, "Oh, this is a good idea."
Well, he did say when in the reprint of the first one, or at least one of the reprints of the first Jack Reacher book, he introduces the book and he talks about how a very unique character is one of the most important things, at least when it comes to mysteries, if not other types of fiction. You know, he talks about the Lone Ranger, how you hardly ever remember the adventures the Lone Ranger got into, but you just watched it because of the Lone Ranger, that type of thing. I'm paraphrasing it. And so he made Jack Reacher that way. And Repairman Jack's certainly like that.
Yeah.
I mean, he's pretty unique.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting that he came up with a character who was also off the grid named Jack. There's nothing supernatural in the Jack Reacher stuff, obviously. And if I recall, I mean, The Tomb has some supernatural stuff, and then the next couple of books kind of get away from that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's just one of the pleasures of reading the Repairman Jack books is how he solves these problems that are thrown at him by clients.
Well, I think the next one was Legacies, and that got away. And then Conspiracies brought the Keep in a big way.
Oh, was that because Conspiracies was the one about Wardenclyffe Tower and Tesla's stuff, right?
I'm not. Conspiracies is the one where he first meets Rapsalam.
Okay.
So I think he was going to a convention of conspiracy theories.
Yeah. Which was a hilarious kind of.
But I think Legacy was the one that had like a science fiction kind of plot. You know, was technology. But everything after Conspiracies is on the fringes, at least, is the bad guy from the Keep.
Right.
Yeah, but they're really fun reads. I highly recommend them.
And Paul has a nice sparse style. I mean, you fly through these books.
That's true. They are the fastest reads I've ever read. I mean, good, fast reads. I mean, it's the series which I can read very fast, comprehend it, be stimulated by a lot of the concepts.
Mm-hmm.
Superb.
Repairman Jack's the one I don't know if I even said it was Repairman Jack a few weeks ago when I talked about this, but this is the guy who goes into Central Park waiting for people to mug him so that he can then beat them up instead, take their money, you know, that they're mugging money for the night, and then give it to a charity. Does that like once or twice a year.
They're short stories which are non-supernatural, which are more of the straightforward thriller.
All right. Anything else? Cloak and Dagger?
I watched that first episode and I liked it.
Yeah, I did too.
What's that on? Is that a network show?
It's on a channel called Freeform.
Yeah, it's used to be ABC Family.
Oh,
It's on Hulu, if you've got Hulu.
Right. Yeah. Somebody told me that that it's on Hulu, but this first episode is kind of everywhere. So I was wondering if that only that first episode was on Hulu.
No, if you don't have Hulu, Freeform has its own channel too. If you get Freeform as part of your cable package, you should be able to. And you missed it, you can watch it on the Freeform channel.
What's it about? Give us a brief synopsis.
There's an explosion in Roxxon Oil Company, which was in Agent Carter, and in about 10 years ago, and 2 children are affected. One is given sort of the power of darkness, and one is given the power of light.
Oh, I did hear about this. I saw the trailer way back when.
One has the power to see everybody's hope, and the other has the power to see everybody's fear. And one can teleport. The male kid can teleport and generate some sort of dark, shadowy substance.
The Dark Force.
It is the Dark Force from Agent Carter, or Dark Matter. It's Dark Matter.
No, but in the original comic was, I think, Dark Force.
Well, it's whether they call it's whatever was in that Agent Carter, because they had Roxxon Oil experimenting with this stuff. It's going to tie into that.
I don't know. I just don't know if I want to watch another movie about teens. You know, I couldn't get through Riverdale.
Well, I'll put it this way: if you liked Runaways, you'll like this. If somebody has seen Runaways on, I forget what
that was on
Hulu. That was on Hulu.
It's on Hulu too. Yeah.
Exclusively on Hulu.
Riverdale is torturing me.
You're still watching it?
Isabel likes it because she likes. I guess she likes watching the drama, and it's like I can barely tolerate it. It's like
it's a soap opera.
Yeah, it's exactly what it is.
But remember, Mike, you liked Buffy.
I know, but those were good.
Well, this has a nice high school feel a little bit. But we're going to get beyond. Well, the girl is not in high school. The girl has an interesting profession. I'll put it that way.
Or maybe I'm just burnt out on them because I've seen Buffy and Smallville. You know, so.
I sure liked where this first episode went. I thought it was a different feel than, say, The Runaways or anything like that. It's a little darker, and I'm surprised to hear that Freeform used to be ABC Family, because this does not feel family-oriented, but, you know, nothing is.
And all the commercials I saw when I was watching it on cable television, all the other shows seemed to be very adult.
Oh, okay.
Or, you know, not the original pre-ABC Family channel, which was, you know, part of the Christian network.
Right. Maybe that's why they decided to change the name of it.
Yeah. Well, back then they used to show Batman, and they showed there's a classic episode with King Tut, where Batman, he's with an actress played by, the actress is Lee Merriweather, and he's playing his love interest. And it was the one thing where they alluded to that Batman was going to basically have a affair at the end. And they cut that out. That's the famous Milk and Cookies. Want to come up to my apartment for milk and cookies? And he goes, yes, I love to have milk and cookies.
They decided that was too racy, huh?
Yeah, and that was cut out. They used to show The Man from U.N.C.L.E., so I can just imagine what they did was that.
Well, Asa Pell wrote a really good review of this, The Searching Dead, on the Lovecraft Zine website. It's the latest post, lovecraftzine.com. And I'm just getting into it. It's really good.
It is vintage Ramsey Campbell.
And it's part 1 of a trilogy. I've read the second one's out.
Is there a cliffhanger at the end of it? of part
No,
one?
it's going to sort of complete in itself.
Oh, that's good.
The next one, it's sort of like it in a sense, in that the next one takes place, it's with kids, and the next one is the kids become an adult. And he's facing a reiteration of what he faced in the first book.
Okay.
Born to the Dark, I think, is the title, if I remember correctly.
Well, we're just reading a little bit of Aesop's review. He writes such great reviews. Speaking of Ramsey Campbell, of course, he says his work exemplifies, like no other, Mark Fisher's understanding for the pool and attraction of Lovecraftian fiction. Quote, the allure that the weird and the eerie possess is not captured by the idea that we enjoy what scares us. It has rather to do with the fascination for the outside, for that which lies beyond standard perception, cognition, and experience. This fascination usually involves a certain apprehension, perhaps even dread, but it would be wrong to say that the weird and the eerie are necessarily terrifying. So, you know, and just to talk about that for a second, that's my favorite part of, that's why I read cosmic horror or read horror to begin with. You know, this hint that there's something out there that you don't understand, and it may not even explain it.
I'll also say, even though it's a Cthulhu mythos story, you could enjoy that with knowing nothing about the mythos.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else, guys? You got a really good prize, right, Matt?
Yes, I do. It's, if you liked our author, Steve Rasnic Tem, and you like oversized books from Centipede Press,
Good God.
I'm putting my name in for that one.
Out of the Dark, a storybook of horrors.
Out of the Dark.
Mike, I have one question. You
Yes.
mentioned the alligator movie before. Have you ever shown that on movie night?
No.
It's available. Well, it used to be on YouTube. I don't know if it's still there. You may look it up. That would be a fun movie to watch on a Saturday night.
In a Mystery Science Theater 3000 sort of way.
Right.
You know, I have very few guilty pleasures.
The exact quote from Rick Seam is, by the way, tell Pete he owes me back 90 minutes of my life. The Alligator People was just as lame on second viewing as it was when I saw it in the theater as a kid.
Oh, it's got Lon Chaney Jr. in it. How can you not enjoy it?
But he's got a bit part as a heavy.
Yeah.
If he was the alligator guy, I might have bought into all this.
Oh, George McCready is also a good actor too. He's been in a lot of things. He played the scientist, if I remember correctly.
Right.
All right. Go ahead, Kelly. Sorry.
Oh, I'm just disappointed that Matthew hasn't dropped his "what a crock" joke yet.
Oh, Jesus.
So what was the name of that prize? I don't know what's wrong with me today.
Out of the Dark?
Out of the Dark.
Yeah.
If you would like to be in the random drawing for Out of the Dark, the title is Out of the Dark, send an email to lovecrafteasingprizes@gmail.com. Lovecrafteasing, E-Z-I-N-E. Lovecrafteasingprizes@gmail.com, and put Out of the Dark in the subject of the email, and maybe in the body of the email if you don't mind. Tell us how you watch or listen to the show. If you watch it, do you watch it live, or do you like or do you watch the recorded version later, or do you just listen as most people do, so that they can, take it with them and listen on the go? So anyway, next week is Father's Day. We're not going to have a show, and then the week after that we've got Kat Roca, and the week after that Richard Chismar, and then Jeffrey Ford. So we've got some more great guests coming up.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So,
Suddenly we're the it place to be on a Sunday night.
suddenly.
It only took us 8 years. No,
It's the longest overnight
Only took
success ever.
23 years to get there.
well, so it's
then people have to listen to stuff like the Alligator People.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's
well.
funny because the other day I was in Barnes and Noble and they had a sign on, they do their staff picks and it's like what we're enjoying now. The great new writer, Joe Lansdale.
Oh boy.
And I'm like,
You're on the staff.
You gotta be kidding me.
Probably been writing before some of these people were born.
Well, and yes, and it's not just that Happen Leonard was a really good show that got canceled, but Happen Leonard was a really good series. Is a really good series of books. And yeah, I've been reading Joe Lansdale since I was knee high to a grasshopper.
And by the way, I just want to let you know, Attack of the Alligator People traumatized me as a kid when I saw the trailer when I was 5 years old. And I never watched it till about 3 or 4 years ago, where Pete mentioned they said I should watch this movie.
Boy,
Well,
I had nightmares about alligator people attacking me at night.
Well, I've seen the results of those nightmares, and I never want to see them again.
Right.
Okay, one last thing. There is a movie, I don't know if it's available right now. Adam Neville posted about it, and I watched the trailer. It's called Cold Skin, and it looked very
I've been waiting for
Lovecraftian.
that to come out on Amazon.
So he was able to watch it, and I'm not sure if he saw it in the theater over there or if it's just a DVD release in the UK right now or what, but the trailer looks really cool about a guy who's in a lighthouse with, it looks like deep ones coming to attack.
And it's based on a book called Cold Skin, which I may get. But yeah, this is probably the 5th time I've searched for it on Amazon to see if I could rent it, and it's still not there.
Oh, okay.
So, but I've heard really good things about this movie, that it's Lovecraftian, that it's just, well, I mean, I'm really a sucker for, it's on the edges of the he's in a lighthouse, isn't he? Yeah.
Yes.
So for that reason alone, I've got to read it. But
you must have loved Day of the Triffids if you're into people being attacked in lighthouses.
Lighthouse stories, I should say.
You planted that story.
Yep. Annihilation.
Well,
Annihilation.
time to
That
go.
was a great spin on The Color Out of Space, I thought. So, all right, yeah. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks everybody for listening, and we will talk to you in 2 weeks.
See ya.